Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at the last panel of this conference. I'm really happy to welcome you, at least virtually. This panel is kind of a follow-up on the preceding panel because it will touch also on the topic of development in the external dimension of the Czech policy. On the other hand, we are also moving more to the question of taking gender as a right and also opening the issue of gender-based violence that connects both together. So the main goal is to connect those together, because my impression is that very often, and it's not only about gender issues, that the Czech foreign policy in terms of human rights and in development are pretty much disconnected. And I think this panel has also the ambition to cover this gap. On the other hand, I really need to say and acknowledge that we now have probably the most feminist foreign minister ever, which is a great accomplishment. And I also think that was like for the first time that a couple of days ago, the Czernin Palace, where we were supposed to meet originally, was all lit in orange, that beautiful Baroque palace, to show the ministry's commitment to end gender violence. But as my pragmatic side would say, follow the money. And when you really look at where Czech money for supporting those rights goes, we don't see much. There was like 2 or 3 projects within the transition programs that was especially focused on gender-based violence among the hundreds of projects within the transition. And of course, it takes time for the activities that the Czech Republic takes at the different human rights fora to trickle down into real action. We've heard enough about a kind of gender blindness of the Czech Development Corporation already. I can only confirm that also from within this project that the conference makes also part, to see that even NGOs that are generally very aware of gender issues when it comes to agriculture could kind of to stay blind to the fact that in the province in Zambia where they operate, there is 1/3 of female-headed households, very often also a product of gender-based violence. So those connections to well-being of women is very often missing from our projects. Now, also, it would be a little bit, well, we cannot really go by not mentioning the impacts of COVID. Of course, you can see that it also has a political dimension, which is also at the center of this panel. Just look at the neighboring Poland, how the government and the judicial system have somehow benefited to stomp on women's rights. Recently, maybe we have the chance in the Czech Republic also for our foreign policy not to have such, I would say, strong male-dominated institutions like the Catholic Church to step into policy making. And so the kind of a more liberal approach within the Czech society towards contraception and other issues can be an asset for the foreign policy to put forward. On the other hand, I think there is a big risk also on the economic side. The deputy minister has mentioned that the extreme right parties have already proposed to cut transition and development aid within next year's budget. And it's a real danger that there are such initiatives from some parliamentary parties. And it's clear that the economic crisis will also take a toll on those parts of the budget that are very easy to be cut very soon, like development aid. So I think that it's another argument for us to talk about how we can make Czech development cooperation and human rights policy better. Having said that, let's just go back to the 3 main points we would like to make in this, to discuss in this panel. One, we would like to explore the link from women's empowerment for gender violence, their health, reproduction rights towards sustainable development. Secondly, also to look at the more like practical side to how to reach that within contexts that can be even more difficult than the Central Europeans concepts in terms of anti-gender movements with religious sensitivities and so on. And finally, really to have some very straightforward recommendations for the Czech foreign and development policy. To answer to those questions, we have a great panel with three very experts really to the point. We would start with Johanna Nejedlová, who is the founder and executive director of Konsent. I'm happy also to have a kind of a representative of the youth, that they are very important to forward the gender issues, and also somebody who, sometimes I would say, unlike the ministries, really walks the talk, and someone who took her own experience with gender-based violence into turning it in something positive and founding this NGO that helps, that has different programs to limit it within the Czech Republic, and who has, I think, the very understanding of the idea of women's empowerment. And she's also was voted by the American magazine Bitch as one of the top female personalities of this year globally. So welcome. Secondly, I'm really happy to have Evni Emin, also who is a very experienced scientist with hundreds, if not thousands, of quotations in the best medical journals. She's a scientist with the reproductive health department at the World Health Organizations in Geneva. Welcome, Evni. And last but not least, Jana Hybáčková, ambassador and currently special envoy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but who also has a very rich experience as ambassador of the Czech Republic in a couple of countries, and also at the political side as a member of the European Parliament, and who also more recently was also the ambassador of the European Union to Iraq and Namibia. That is the very regions that are in our focus for this panel. So thank you for being here, and I would start by giving the floor to Johanna for her introduction.
Hi. First of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity to speak up here, but I would also like to thank to all participants of the conference for attending a conference covering topic often dismissed and its importance dismissed by the majority. I will start with my personal story, which will provide you with a basic context of how I get where I am now. And then I will move to work which organization Konsent is doing in the field of prevention of sexual violence and how we benefited from all our international cooperations. So I remember when I was about 10 years old, I was going to school in the Prague city center. I'd be taking the metro every day. But on this particular day, I was at the platform entering the train and someone behind me slipped his hand under my skirt and whispered to my ear, "Do you know what I'm doing to little girls like you? I raped them." I was terrified and I tried to get away as fast as I could. I didn't tell this story to anyone until I was adult. Then a few years later, I was already attending high school and I was using a tram to get to school. And one morning, this tram was really full and somebody slipped their fingers not only under my skirt, but also under my panties. And I turned to see who was it. But everyone was acting normal, but the same happened to me following day. So I started to walk to school every morning. In the years to come, I started to go to bars and clubs occasionally, as all the teenagers do. But quite often men were harassing me, touching me non-consensually or by the way, like accidentally, or were trying to push me to drink with them. I was never talking much about it with anybody because I somehow felt ashamed. And finally, when I was about 23, one guy in a bar drugged me and raped me. And after this, finally, I started to talk about the situation with my friends. And I found out that too many of my friends experience the same kind of things. I would not be such a surprise if I had known the data that 1 in 10 women in Czech Republic experiences rape within her lifetime, and that most of the crimes are committed by someone close to the victim, in 50% by partner or husband. One of my friends, for example, was locked by a taxi driver in the car and pushed to perform oral sex on him. The other was forced by her boyfriend repeatedly to have sex with him, even if she really didn't want it. One was raped raped on a party while she was really drunk. I remember when my friend, father of 3 girls, asked me what he should tell them to protect them from the violence, what advice he should give them. I had nothing to say to him because I believe that for a girl who wants to lead normal social life, there is not much she could do to protect herself. The only way to protect girls and women from violence is to educate the society about what the violence and rape really is and what consequences it has as a whole. Then a few years later, I launched Konsent. It actually happened by coincidence. I found online research by Amnesty International done to support ratification of Istanbul Convention, which, by the way, has not still been ratified in Czech Republic due to the ultra-conservative opposition, fake news, and maybe also lack of interest of politicians to act to protect women from violence. This research said that 63% of Czech believed at the time that a victim of rape is partly responsible for what happened to them. For example, if they were drunk, flirting, wearing short skirts, etc. I wrote a post on social media about my experience and call for the need to stop this narrative. It went viral and lots of women and men were reaching to me. At the end, we met and decided to launch one campaign, and this campaign later turned into an NGO. So what we are doing in Konsent? We are trying to highlight and explain the context surrounding sexual violence and sexual harassment, provide with data, stories, but also with solutions. When we started to speak about rape, we collected relevant stories, created videos from them, and fundraised money to start workshops about consent and rape in schools. Then when we wanted to open the subject of sexual harassment, we did the same and started a project called Respect is Hot, within which we create network of harassment-free bars and clubs. And the same we are now doing with the academic environment. With the project for schools, we are now shifting into the whole sexual education as we follow the International Convention of Rights of a Child, granting the right to children to information and education also on topic of sex, sexuality, intimate relationships, and sexual violence. Because based on sufficient information and education, the child is then able to form their own opinions, to make their own decisions regarding their sexual life, and what is really important, to set their own boundaries and gains the ability to understanding necessary for respecting the boundaries of the others. If we do not take in consideration all the attacks of haters we are receiving and struggles with financing, the Konsent is doing really great. We grew in 3 years into the team of 10 employees, about 25 lectures and 20 active volunteers. On social media platforms, we have a great impact. And lately we are receiving about 200 messages on Instagram daily. Young people are sharing with us their stories and struggles with stereotypes about sex, sexual violence, and also with other stuff. But why is it so? We are choosing a bit different narrative than it's usual for the topics of sexual relations and intimacy. To highlight the absurdity of stereotypes, we are using quite often humor. We do not add to the raped woman trope and don't portray her as a devastated, sad person, because we believe that most of them will overcome their trauma, and nobody, personally not me, wants to relate with these sad pictures. And during all our programs and workshops, we choose rather to let people discuss and share their opinions as partners, rather than frontline lecture where we would be the one sharing our perspective. We believe that this work, as we are doing now about 5 workshops per week due to COVID online, we are usually getting great feedback and everybody is benefiting from it. And we are trying to be there very authentic. And even if we are very professional organizations, we are still keeping the spirit of group of young people with an intention to make the world, or at least Czech Republic, safer environment for women. We are sharing our daily struggles, successes, but also kind of our fuck-ups to be more relatable to young people. Because we need as much people as possible to be feeling part of our group or our movement. And we believe that this can be done only by being real and authentic. To get to the international comparisons we are engaged in, we discovered that Konsent shares the same values, but also the same tactics with lots of different initiatives all around the world. For example, when we planned to start the project with bars, we discovered that there are already 2 existing initiatives in UK and in Israel doing the same. And it was really great to have opportunity to consult with them our own steps. And I remember that when we started to go to abroad, we thought that we have to share with others our activity with other activists, our best practice and our activities. But really soon we found out that more effective is to have space to discuss the obstacles we all are facing and to discuss the strategies to overcome them. We learned that not only to export our know-how, what we have in Konsent, to other activists or to try there to work, it doesn't work. We need to trade our informations and know-how and approaches with the others and their organizations, which has the similar outlooks on the topics, and translate them later into our own national context. Because the approach is not transmissible, it has to be sensitive to specifics of each country and culture, and it has to be done by the locals who know the best what their needs actually are. We learned that no matter if you are in Jordan, in UK, or in Czech Republic, girls encountered the similar struggles originating really from similar stereotypes. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Johanna. We can follow up in the discussion. I think that's great to show that already the situation in the Czech Republic is very far from being ideal. I really like the idea that actually women is not the same thing as gender, and the need that sometimes you really need and maybe only need to work with, and especially need to work with men for the project. I think that this approach is not very much accepted. like mainstreamed in the thinking of gender in the developmental context. And finally, I think we can come back to that as well, the role of social media, of technology that is now widespread and more easily accessible also in many developing countries. And I mean, the social media that are at the forefront of a fight against gender violence. Now let's learn more about the context, more about big data to get an idea what is happening and how this kind of relation from empowerment, violence to well-being and final sustainable development. So Avni, please tell us more.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me for this conference, and thank you to all the participants in advance for your patient listening. I also wanted to thank Johanna for sharing her very personal story. I think it takes a lot of courage. Many of us have personal stories, and it takes a while to process the trauma of abuse and violence and to come out, and yet it's very inspiring for a lot of people to hear what you just expressed. I wanted to answer the 3 questions, and while answering some of the questions, I also wanted to share the global data that we have on how violence or gender-based violence affects the health of women and girls. I wanted to start by first acknowledging, in terms of the response to the question on the links between women's empowerment and their well-being. And the first statement I wanted to make is that women's and girls' ability to choose and to have control over their bodies, over their sexuality, and over their reproduction, which is known as what we call bodily autonomy and integrity. This is actively restricted in many parts of the world. It is actively opposed. Their right to control their bodies, their right to control their sexuality and their fertility is actively opposed by many in international development and health agendas. And a lot of these health and development agendas are negotiated by ministries of foreign affairs and by diplomats. And I will give you one example of this negotiation that we had in WHO World Health Assembly resolution on a resolution on violence against women and girls a little bit later. I also wanted to say that governments in many countries legislate or put in place laws or policies that undermine women's rights and their bodily autonomy and integrity, and this adversely affects their health. Women's lack of power and their status is a universal fact in all societies of the world. The degree to which it manifests is different. So for example, I live in Switzerland. Women dying from maternal deaths in Switzerland is much, much less compared to, say, a woman dying from maternal death in a country like Niger, which has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. However, and when I say this, people are shocked, is that even where I live, which is in Switzerland, 1 in 5 women, that is 20% of Swiss women, are experiencing domestic violence, largely at the hands of intimate partner violence. This is, of course, much less than in Afghanistan, where it is 1 in 2 or 52% of Afghan women experiencing domestic partner violence. I'm going to show you some graphs now, just to give you a sense of 3 things. One is how widespread is women and girls' limited autonomy to have a say in being able to go and seek healthcare on their own, without permission and without needing to take somebody else with them. The second is the rates of intimate partner violence among adolescent girls in the age of 15 to 19. And the third graph I'm going to share is the consequences of health that women and girls 15 to 19 face all around the world in terms of the largest causes of death and morbidity. So just give me 1 second to switch on the share screen function. So in this graph, what you can see is data that comes from surveys, which shows that young women, married women who do not have a say, which means that they cannot control the ability to seek healthcare on their own. So we are looking at two age groups, young women, adolescent girls 15 to 19, and young women in the age group 20 to 24. And you can see that in Niger, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Guinea, and Cameroon, by and large, no more than 1 in 5 or 20% of women can say that they are able to seek healthcare on their own. 52% of women overall, okay, are not able to make decisions about their own health in rural areas compared to 47% of women in urban areas. So that is 50% of women and girls who cannot actually control how to seek healthcare. This next slide is data from WHO, which shows that violence, particularly intimate partner violence, is widespread. It is a marker of extreme gender inequality, and this is for ages 15 to 19. So in the Africa region, 40% of girls 15 to 19 say that they have been subjected to physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. This figure in the Eastern Mediterranean region, which is the Middle East region, is around 25%. But even in high-income countries of Western Europe, North America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, this figure is around 15%. So as you can see, this is a very high number of girls, 15 to 19-year-olds, saying that they have been either physically or sexually abused by their intimate partner being a boyfriend. In many countries, they are married already by this time. And that's a huge, huge number. Here I'm going to show you some of the consequences of denying women and girls control over their bodies. And here we can see that in the age group of 15 to 19 above, which is for females, and it's a black bar, one of the highest leading causes of mortality in 15 to 19-year-old girls is depression and self-harm or suicide. And in some countries like Africa, it is maternal deaths. So girls 15 to 19 dying from maternal deaths, they should not be becoming pregnant that young, but they do because they don't, because many of them are not able to control their sexuality, because in many cases they are subjected to sexual violence, becoming pregnant. When you look at the top 5 causes for adolescent girls 15 to 19 that are causing them ill health, unsafe sex and intimate partner violence is among the top 5 causes, along with alcohol use and iron deficiency. But unsafe sex and intimate partner violence, 2 top 5 causes of why adolescent girls are becoming sick. So that brings me to the second question. How should we tackle sexual and reproductive health and rights in sensitive political and religious context? And I want to say 3 things. The 3 things are, first is the power of evidence and science and the obligations that countries have to human rights norms and standards. The second is investment in autonomous women's movements, so feminist women's movements and organization, and the power of having champions against gender-based violence and champions for women's empowerment within governments and within organizations. So here I'm going to show you another graph, power of data. This is a graph that looks at abortion data in Romania. And what you can see is that before 1989, abortion, which is represented by the green line, and the maternal mortality due to abortion is extremely high because abortion was restricted in Romania. Then comes 1989 and Romania legalizes abortion. And of course, everybody was extremely worried that this will increase in abortion. And instead, what they saw is abortion levels demand drastically drop to extremely low levels, just a little bit above between 0 and 20%. And that is extremely low. The power of evidence. If all 225 million women who needed contraception had access to contraception, we would see 52 million fewer unintended pregnancies, 24 million fewer abortions. So giving women access to contraception would lead to fewer abortions and 21 million unplanned deaths, fewer miscarriages and fewer stillbirths. And finally, a data that I know most governments like, which is the economic impact. We know from countries that give lifetime cost to the GDP of adolescent pregnancy is high. In Uganda, it costs, girls becoming pregnant is costing Ugandan economy 30% lifetime GDP. This, of course, in USA, Norway, Sweden is much less of 1%. So even the economic argument for why we should be addressing these issues and investing in women's empowerment and violence is huge. It saves dollars and cents and euros. Finally, I wanted to talk about the power of women's movements and organizations in changing the landscape for gender-based violence, laws, and policies over 4 decades. This is a paper that was published in the American Political Review, and it shows that from 1975, which is the first graph on top left, to 2005, so 40 years later, the number of countries that implemented or put in place laws protecting violence against women. So the darker the color navy blue, the more laws and policies that were put in place for violence against women protection increased. And this increase matched the ability to have countries with feminist, autonomous women's movements. So what made this success is basically funding feminist, autonomous women's rights organizations and movements that brought about this dramatic change in laws and policies against violence against women. Here, I'm just showing you some pictures because in the last 4 years, it has been the time when there has been tremendous activism by women's rights organizations worldwide. In Argentina, in support of decriminalization of abortion. In Ireland, tremendous activism by women's organizations led to the repeal of the abortion law. In Sudan, huge amount of women were out on the streets protesting violence. In India, of course, we know from 2012, large numbers of women were out marching. In Chile and in Colombia, everywhere. Power of government champions. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about the World Health Assembly resolution in 2014, which was negotiated by diplomats representing their missions in Geneva. And we had tremendous number of champions who made it possible to have a resolution for ministries of health to take seriously violence against women as a public health issue. Of course, we had one of the big champions we had was Her Excellency Dr. Christine Kaseva, who was at the time the First Lady of Zambia, who was a doctor, a medical doctor herself, who championed this. And this is a speech that she gave to the Ministries of Health and Foreign Affairs at the World Health Assembly in 2014. Since then, we have invested as WHO a lot of effort to create champions within Ministries of Foreign Affairs and within Ministries of Health, including in countries like Iraq, including in countries like Afghanistan, which has one of the largest programs of rolling out gender-based violence health programs, training 7,000 healthcare providers all over the country in the most difficult of circumstances. And this is possible because you have champions within the government. So the power of champions within the government is huge. So my closing that I want to just say, and I'm going to say last question, which is, what should the Czech foreign and development policies look like? The first is to say, invest in comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights, which includes funding for GBV, harmful gender practices, and really promoting women's rights and bodily autonomy. Second, use the power of science and data from public health and elsewhere to advocate and counter religious and socio-cultural sensitivities. use the power of human rights norms and obligations that countries have already signed on to and ratified in CEDAW, CRC, Universal Declarations, and many others to advance progressive SRHR agendas, fund, invest in women's autonomous organizations in their respective countries, because they are the ones who will be on the streets making the change, and nurture, foster, and use champions within governments, within ministries to really advocate for change. Thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Avni, for this great overview of the all the kind of like all the stages of the link, finishing by the huge impacts, as you said on the example of Uganda, 1/3 of GDP. That's really enormous. And it shows that maybe focusing on promoting more civil society organizations on sexual and reproductive rights can be even a more impactful way for promoting economic growth than shifting money to business organizations and funding companies in a way, especially during economic crisis. I hope that this message will be retained, and I hope there are policymakers from the MFA and from the Czech Development Agency currently listening. And anyway, we will find a way for the message to reach them or otherwise. Thank you very much. If you listeners have any questions, I would just remind you, as for the whole conference, you have two ways to ask your questions. The one way is to put it in the Slido question, I would say like a box under your video. The other way is to click on the link to Zoom, and you enter in a kind of waiting room where my colleague from the conference service will give you more details for you to intervene directly or through a video in the Q&A session. Now let's go even more closer to the ground in Africa and the Middle East. And now I give the floor to the Ambassador Jana Hybášková, who will share her experience as a female diplomat and one of the gender champions in the Czech foreign policy. Please.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for allowing me to share with you my personal more experiences than only professional experience. And welcome to everyone who is ready to listen Friday afternoon to such a particular topic, which obviously in a formal and informal media in the Czech Republic is not the key highlight, because people somehow still believe that gender-based violence, as was said, is a personal and individual trouble of a half of mankind, which has to deal with it. I'm not an expert in this particular area. By my expertise, I'm an Arabist who had the pleasure to study Arabic and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies, and who spent basically more than 2/3 of my life in the Middle East. And finally, I can do some very particular comparison, because recently I served as the head of EU delegation, that means EU ambassador, to one of SADC countries, Namibia, which is a developing country without the presence of Islam. So I can do quite a unique thing to compare GBV in Islamic countries and GBV in totally non-Islamic country, which I believe is a particular experience. For me, speaking about development with all the years of my life and professional experience and experiences, I am more and more humble using the word sustainable development. As before 10 or 15 years, everything was glorious and we were just launching sustainable development like flying to the moon. I now believe that we have to be a very particular and very careful using this sustainable development if we can use the word development at all. And I have to say, let's be very prudent in this particular regard. Unfortunately, in my life, it occurred to me that I spent almost more than 9 years in war zones and areas steered by any kind of militarized interventions and conflicts. And I have learned one thing, that to speak about development at all, we have to be able to start this discussion of stabilized or stable societies. And for me, the word stabilization currently actually matters much more than the word development, because we cannot speak about development unless we speak about stabilization. And to get a stable society, we need to have a stable family, we need to have a stable mother, and we have to have a stable child. And to have stable child, stable mother, and stable family is a prerequisite of the human development, which unfortunately is met in a very few parts of our globe. And this is a problem. So speaking about GBV, speaking about situation of women, about women's rights, we have to be able to think about stable societies without which we will not be able to reach, to decrease the tensions. CEDAW quite clearly tell us that 90% of conflicts occurring in 21st century are conflicts which come from reoccurrence. That means we were not able to offer enough of stability to vast areas of West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, and to be able at least to launch, to start, to restart development. So once again, stabilization and getting out of conflicts is something what I see as a key prerogative for further sustainable development. And in this, gender-based violence plays much, much more important role than we are ready to think. So I think that first of all, and I think that we agree with all my participants, is that we really are too prudent, too shy, and the shyness is not what we should do. The prudence is not what we should do. And we have to be able to speak up, to speak out, and to be heard. And this is definitely not yet the case. Yes, we have these fantastic UN conventions on the right of child, on the right of women, against the racial discrimination, against degrading treatment. None of them is really enforced. We have universal periodic review of human rights in every country globally. All us diplomats, be it Europeans and non-Europeans plus United States, sit together and do UPR periodic review. I would stress that exactly position of the gender-based violence is not perfectly reflected in usually UPRs. If we take UPR as a kind of the diplomatic exercise going from A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, then we have gender-based violence somewhere there in the position 15. And again, it's about birth, it's about child, and it's about mother, it's about family, it's about cornerstones of our society. And so I think that one of the things is to really redo the practice of how we do UPRs globally. That's one of my humble assessment from what I have been through. Now, speaking about GBV in the Middle East, as a female who lived many years in different countries and who had the pleasure to be first ever female ambassador to Qatar and first ever female ambassador to Kuwait, I'm very often asked about the rights of women, exactly about their bodily integrity, about their physical integrity, about their right to decide upon her own destiny and life in the Middle East. Not living in a SADC country, I would have said, yes, there are very deep structural issues in the Middle East concerning this situation. Unfortunately, after living in SADC, I must very frankly say that in Islamic societies, we have Sharia, we have Islamic law, and woman has a legal protection. Woman exists, even though 1/4 or 1/5 or 1/2 of the men's right, she still exists. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, legally, practically, women do not exist. She has no right to be protected. She has no right to decide to say no. She has no right to protect her physical integrity. And where we start when we discuss with all these things, physical integrity is the basics where you go to any discussion on human rights. When physical integrity is a question, then what is the question for 50% of the population? I had a pleasure to work with WHO in Namibia in building neonatal centers in the most remote parts of our planet. I had a pleasure to run in complex some 20 million euros projects concerning gender-based violence. Only a couple of figures to share with you is in informal settlements of the country called Namibia, the longest period in which young person, female between 12 and 17, has not witnessed cruel gender violence, physical violence, is 1 month. It's the longest period during which female persons in informal settlements were not attacked, were not harassed, and unfortunately were not killed, because the rate of women's killing in SADC countries is enormous. This goes together with the second point, which is teenager pregnancy. In sub-Saharan African countries, teenager pregnancy is a major issue, and she has no right to say no. So there is a global, very big movement, which is actually sponsored by many EU states, saying you have a right to say no. They do not know the girls. And HIV, TBC, plus being 12, having the first child, being forced to family prostitution, then leaving her village, going to the local, regional, local center, being forced to prostitution, having another child, again in the conditions of HIV and TBC. We have no clue how the society are structurally broken, how every second female is practically not able to decide on her physical integrity. How can we believe that these people will have stable families, will live in normal situations, and then, sorry to speak, in Central European conditions on migration, how can we believe that they will stay where they are? So to stabilize the situation, the female situation means to stabilize the feminist situation. And hence my second suggestion is we have to be able to work with families and to support families. If she marries him and they are 18 years old and only then they have a child, they deserve structure and developmental support. They deserve us to tell us, this is okay, this is how you should live, and we support this type of the human development. How to get there? Definitely education. And this is UNICEF, this is UNESCO, this is WHO, this is many and many. My suggestion for many countries in the world is to make the life skills education, however it's called in this or that particular country, a compulsory subject, which is an examinable subject. Otherwise, it's not being taught. And girls never hear that actually they can say no. They never hear, no one tells them. Neither their mothers, not their fathers, not their brothers. Only school can tell them, but then we really need them to go to life skills education and to listen to this type of information. Now, going back to the Middle East, trying to be very short, the issue is trafficking, which is not recognized for kind of a political prudency. Gulf Cooperation Council countries from Kuwait to Oman, enormous South Asian trafficking of a very young woman being used as a servants in the families. It's not mentioned in the global trafficking reports, and I think it's a very big issue, just a short notice. But my worst experience with gender-based violence is a humanitarian disaster situations. And I'm not speaking on attacks of attackers. I'm not speaking about the Yazidis, and I have, unfortunately, as EU ambassador, witnessed Islamic State being born in the country I was responsible for. But what happens in refugee camps, the standards which do not exist and are not followed. I spent mega hours walking from one camp to another where you have 100,000 population, 200,000 population. You don't have separated toilets, you don't have proper evening lighting, and the amount of GBV in the camps is something what we cannot imagine, and no one speaks about it. The worst thing I can speak about in my life, and I will cry when I speak about it, is a little A4 format where you have a sheet and soap and gloves. And then you have kind of a cartoon. This cartoon tells you how to give a birth to child. This is called clean delivery kit. I'm sure that my colleague from WHO know what it means. To go and distribute clean delivery kits to 10 years old 12 years old girls in refugee camps, I do not wish this to anyone to see. So we have huge, massive gaps in human rights, in stabilization of society, in right to decide on her own life. They even do not know that they can say no. So the gap between us speaking in UPRs about Convention on Child and these and these and these and trafficking reports and the reality is much wider than we believe it is. Therefore, my strong recommendation, and I'm not today representing Czech Foreign Ministry, but I speak about it loudly, unless we start to make a very close nexus between stabilization development and family policy and family planning, we will not go anywhere. Trouble in European Union, and here I am harsh and loud critic, is that because of Malta Constitution, Ireland Constitution, and some laws in Poland, there is no agreement of 27 member states. So if we, by mere chance, once a year in some New York declaration, use the wording sexual and reproduction health, we are heroes. That's big. The problem is that we cannot even speak about it. We cannot relate the development cooperation assistance with all these millions and millions euros which will go to Africa and Eastern neighborhood with proper family planning and family policies. And my humble experience is actually Middle Eastern governments and African governments, they do expect us to speak about it because they cannot. They have trouble with their own population. But if they would be approached by EU and being told as a EU is the biggest donor, okay, we will work with you on reasonable family planning policy together with WHO, together with UNICEF and UNESCO, we can get much farther, but we are not doing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That's, I think, a very strong message about promoting a truly feminist foreign policy and not to be afraid of speaking up, that there is not actually much to lose and that can even be expected from the other parts. And that relates also to we already received 2 questions from our listeners. I would start by asking first, Johanna. The question goes about, well, I was going to ask about how your message of consent, how is it received by men who are very often also perpetrator of violence. But in addition to that, the question from the public goes in a rather similar direction, that with the mainstream silence on downturning gender-based violence, how do you react, or what would be your recommendations to address women who are downplaying the very harsh situation that we have?
It is true that there's part of the society, and they are not only men, but part of the society which doesn't want to hear about sexual violence or about violence on women, and they are not willing to listen anything about it. And we actually in Konsent, we decided we don't have enough resources or capacities to try to convince them. And we decided to focus on much more effective audience, or much more younger audience, which is much more willing to listen and is much more willing to actually change their behavior or join our movement. sometimes we are doing discussions with those people who oppose us or don't agree with us, but we are doing it not with intention to convince them, but with intention to give the arguments to the people who are listening or reading this discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. The second question that we received goes to the question of menstrual health. From my experience from the Czech projects in Ethiopia, big gap also in the projects in the education sector. Just thinking about schools, the menstrual period leaves many girls in many rural contexts worldwide out of schooling. How would you address that question, Avni, and what would be your recommendations?
Thank you. Yeah, I think as part of the international development and aid agenda, access to clean water, because that's one of the very critical things in menstrual health that is needed. So really focusing on that. The second one is access to toilets. The understanding that all households have toilets is not there. I mean, I come from India where a large proportion of households don't have toilets, and in schools, you don't have toilets separate for girls and boys. And it's absolutely critical that for menstrual health, you have toilets for both boys and girls. The third, and this is, I sort of joke about it sometimes, but to make sanitary pads and napkins an essential product. Viagra is cheaper for men to buy than menstrual hygiene products. Menstrual hygiene products are needed by all women. Viagra, not really. And yet Viagra is accessible to a lot of men, but menstrual hygiene products are not. And that really speaks to what I call a gender blind policy. 50% and in most countries, menstrual hygiene products are taxed. That means that when you tax something that is so basic, that is so essential, you actually make it difficult for a lot of girls and a lot of women to access this. So remove the taxation on menstrual products, make them more accessible and affordable. This is something that girls will need from the age of 11 or 12 till they are menopausal. The last thing that I wanted to say is really the importance of normalizing menstrual health and hygiene. In many countries, and including in Europe, menstruation is considered dirty, taboo, something that girls can't talk about. We need to normalize it. It is normal part of body. It is normal part of what girls go through, and it needs to be normalized as something that is as basic as somebody experiencing or an older person facing diabetes or blood pressure, whatever. This is not, it shouldn't be taboo or, something that is girls should be afraid to talk about. I am a mother of two girls, one who's 11 and the other who's 14. And one of the first things we've talked about is menstruation, even before they started menstruating. And one of the first things I did was to make sure they understood that there was no taboo, there was no shame. There was no shame associated with menstruation. I just also wanted to briefly touch on the second issue of why do a lot of women don't acknowledge or downplay GBV. And I think we have to realize that violence directed to women is considered normal. It is a socially acceptable norm in most societies. Oh, it's just a little slap. She must have done something to deserve it. Or she didn't cook her food, or she didn't take care of her child, or she went out without seeking my permission. So therefore she deserves to be hit. Or in many countries, rape is not considered rape within marriage. We don't have countries, in my country, in India, laws do not recognize rape within marriage, which means you assume that once you give consent to marriage, you've given consent to sex, which is not the case. So in that situation, how can you expect women to acknowledge that this is what's happening to them is gender-based violence, when the entire society, the law, the legal system, the religious leaders, the political leaders, the family members, the heads of big institutions are considering gender-based violence to be normal. And so one of the things we actually have to do is to shift the norms that say that gender-based violence is acceptable, that women don't have the right to say no, that women don't have the right to or to be asked for consent. That has to be changed. And unless we change that normalization, we can't expect women, despite all, knowing all the data and evidence, to say that what is happening to them is gender-based violence. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. Well, I must say that's really interesting what you say, the issue of normalization. And also it must be said that in many developing countries, former colonies, that this kind of like normalization of rape within marriage or is actually inherited from the colonial administration. That is not something that could be considered as like a homegrown, you know, that. So I think in that sense, we also bear some responsibility as a country of the North that participated on the colonial system. Now, we also have a next question from the public, and I would address it to Jana Hybášková. You surely saw, well, being yourself as ambassador, as EU ambassador from rather small countries, you have seen the plethora of donors in different countries. What do you think, as we try to, as a Czech Republic, can we really find our place as a champion to address gender issues among the other donors we compete with, so to say?
Well, please consider my remark to be totally informal, but of course, after coming from what I have seen, I started certain discussion lecturing about Africa and talking with my African colleagues from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And formally, the situation within EU27 is really structured. There is not yet any real platform, even discussing the new DG financial instrument that we could put fight against the GBV as one of our development priorities. Neither we can speak about sexual and reproduction health, as I spoke about it already. Nevertheless, it seems that there are EU member states, of course we know the notorious one, be it Sweden or be it Finland and the northern countries, but seems that there is a shift in German thinking, because Germans are really coming strongly back to Africa, giving enormous development assistance through their system, and basically coming to see that many of their projects are being stopped because of incapacitated women, of ill women, of sick women, of teenager pregnancy, and so on and so forth. So being closer and seeing more results and impact of their development assistance in Africa, they are looking around EU member states who might start to create a like-minded group, which will be stronger voice within the EU, bringing the topic of GBV and related issues, and of course female health and sexual and reproduction health to the table. So I believe that Czech Republic, because of its very liberal setup of society, as well as we are one of the least believers from the point of view of Christianity among European states. We are considered the most agnostic state in EU. So I think that there can be slowly and surely, and this is exactly one of the moments why I speak here, is to slowly encourage, sensitize and then encourage and group people who would, while writing any foreign policy documents, be able to speak up and put it there. Can't hear you. Mike?
Here we go. Thank you very much for your answer. I would have an extra question for you, Jana, and maybe first Avni. on a link that we haven't mentioned very strongly by far, and that's also the population policy, because there is a clear link also between women's sexual and reproductive rights and the impact it has on the spacing of children, very important thing that also then translates into other development indicators, the health of newborns, child mortality, and so on. And also, like that's a kind of like a given fact from development economics that that families that have less children with a, say, lower dependency ratio also have a greater socioeconomic performance. On the other hand, the population policies, also due to colonialism and so on, may have can be very sensitive issues. In some countries, they can also raise concerns with some politicians and the different ethnical balances between different groups or part of the country. So this can be a very sensitive issue for any political dialogue. So Avni, how do you tackle, as the World Health Organization, how do you tackle this issue, which is very political, and there can be actually interference from politicians who, by the way, are mostly men who want to have a strong nation with many kids to be the others? How do you deal with that?
I guess my two answers really is, rather than focusing on a population control policy, is to really focus on improving women's access to contraception. I think that, you know, most women want not to have too many children. If you give them access to contraception, I think that is in a way, and give them the choice, not just saying, okay, you only need to use one method, but give them the choice of contraceptives. That I think is extremely important. The second we know is that investing in girls' education, right? Because when you invest in girls to be educated, we know that they will make the choices that will be beneficial to the population, to environment, to children, to, you know, just about everything else. When girls are educated, they tend to delay getting married. They tend to delay having children. And they tend to space the number of how frequently they have children and how many children they want. This is just basic scientific evidence that's been gathered over many decades now. We know this, and yet we don't realize that that the path to all of these things is to make contraceptives available, accessible, giving women the choice, and to educate girls, because that is your path to the best way of addressing the population issues. And not just that, but many, many other benefits. The benefits, I mean, in a way, if you consider from an economic standpoint, the best buy for economies to do well is investing in girls' education and making sure that women all over the world are completing high school and college.
Thank you, yes. Now you had a chance to talk to many politicians in the couloirs, I suppose. So what is your take on this question?
I would like to ask Avni how she would manage that in many Middle Eastern countries. I do not want to name them, that's not the reason, but you know them well. Even as a female lady European ambassador, you cannot buy contraception, sorry. You have to bring it from Europe. Huh? It's really non-existing in many Middle Eastern countries. That's point one. Even in health situations, you know what I speak about. And so that's my first question. And second question, which I was twice facing as an ambassador who was responsible for massive educational projects, be it in Iraq and be it in Namibia, is, well, it's easy to say to teach girls, but to teach girls, you need to teach teachers to be able to teach girls. Huh? And we were really looking, trying to find the ways how to get the basic textbooks on sexual education and bring them not to 100, but to 5, 10, 20 schools to actually make sure that at least someone, 1 or 2 or 3 teachers in XY combined school over there in Zambezi and there would be at least able to speak about sexual education. And you find it is a very complex issue, and teachers do not want to do it. Learners don't want to listen to it. It's such an absolute taboo that it's easy to say educate girls, but how to train the trainers and educate the teachers to educate girls is my question.
It may be a paradox that nowadays for many youngsters porn and the idea of consensuality, that it vehicles may be more accessible than basically proper sexual education. Avni, please.
I wanted to maybe first acknowledge, I think your point about cultural contexts, that you're familiar with, it's extremely hard. My sort of experience, because we have worked on gender-based violence issues in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, both Islamic countries. And my colleagues in my team are working in Iraq, they're working in Sudan, they're working in Egypt. One of the things that we often try to do is to neutralize the religious argument and focus on the health aspect. It's much harder for people with a religious bent of mind to say, that when you point out that, teaching girls about their rights, about their bodies is good for their health, it's good for development, it's good for societies, it's good for your economy. It's much harder to say that this is, that the religious values are not the right values or societies have changed. So we never ever talk, and we often don't use the human rights language in a direct way. We often use the language of respect, of dignity, of well-being, of health, health for the family, etc. And that is I wouldn't say it's easy, but it is an easier entry point to make, even in Afghanistan. In many of these countries, and I can give you a case study, happy to do it offline, but we have a case study from Pakistan where NGOs, and again, focusing on these community organizations, really worked very hard to address the concerns of Islamic scholars about teaching girls sexuality education. And over many years, they overcame some of those concerns of parents, of religious scholars, etc., to be able to implement sexuality education for girls in Pakistan. And it's now been well documented in terms of how to overcome backlash and religious opposition to teaching girls about sexuality issues. And yeah, I mean, after this, I'm happy to send you those case studies, because they document very systematically how to engage with religious scholars in these countries around this issue.
Thank you very much. I think you very much described something that is very on paper at the core of the European strategy, some kind of like principled pragmatism, and that we can use to promote this issue. Unfortunately, our time is really running out, so I would just now leave you some space, 1 minute, for some 1 minute concluding remarks, the main message that you would like to have as a takeaway from this discussion. Let's start with Johanna.
I really believe that to help to fight the gender-based violence in other countries, we need, as already Avni mentioned, support the local initiatives, and from my perspective, that should be also the young females initiatives, because also what happened to us in Konsent and how we grow to a quite big organization is that US embassy supported our work when we were searching for money, and it was really small investment, just few $1,000s, which helped us to develop. And I would be very happy if that opportunity would get any other young women-led organization in other countries, and if this support would go from Czech Republic, I would be proud.
I wish, Johanna, we'll have in the future many young activists like you thanking in similar occasions to the Czech embassy for the support. Avni, what would be your last recommendations?
I will quote WHO's Director General, Dr. Tedros, in a recent paper that he co-authored with the head of UN Women. And I just want to say, I think the message that governments and countries and ministries need to have is that investing in programs around sexual and reproductive health, around bodily autonomy for women and girls is not just the morally right thing to do, but it is economically a smart thing to do. Because when you do these things, it will actually be beneficial to your economies. And that is a very powerful argument to make for governments for whom the bottom line is, what is it going to cost us and what is it going to gain us in terms of the GDP growth. And we have ample evidence that investing in women's rights and empowerment actually is beneficial for economies.
Thank you very much, Avni. Johanna, what would be your takeaway?
Well, as Avni said, of course, we have to use the pragmatic and positive arguments. Might be that health, well-being of women is the entry point, but I would strongly recommend to use the momentum when we are starting the structured discussion on details on neighborhood and development countries, instrument of financing of European Union for the years till 2027, that Czech foreign policy, together with Czech NGOs, be it People in Need or all others, are actually vocal about bringing the issues of sexual and reproduction health and, of course, family planning and the GBV as a one part, a substantial part, an important part of the EU development policies, be it in the Eastern neighborhood and be it in Africa.
Thank you very much for the message. With that, I would like to thank you, Avni, Johanna, for being with us today, for sharing your experience and your immense knowledge. That has been a very, I feel like we need somehow to put many of these things on paper. We need to streamline those important message and very convincing arguments, pragmatic arguments. And unfortunately, we are maybe living in a period where those pragmatic arguments are more listened to than those value-based arguments about women's rights. With that, I would also like to, if you like this issue, I would like to invite you for a follow-up workshop or workshop/training with Avni next week, next Friday. You can see there it's shared on the screen now. We will be sending the invitation very shortly to the Czech participants who are the main focus of this activity within our gender project at the Institute of International Relations. Anyway, but if you are interested in that, you can just write to my email horký@irrcz for more information and for a possibility to participating in that. So now you know Avni, and I think you can look forward to your very rich 90 minutes with more data, more insight on also practical tips how to work with policymakers. So thank you for those who find time on a Friday afternoon to follow this discussion. Many thanks also to those who are behind the screen, so to say, Zdenka on the side of the Institute from Slide Live, so Lucas, I think, who has been there, or maybe more technicians who have been helping us with this. And I would also like to say thanks also to our carers who are taking care of our kids or elderly, so that I personally or many of you can be here and share this discussion today. So this is the end of this panel. This is the end of the conference. This is also almost the end of the gender project that we had here at the IRR, but we are not stopping working on gender issues. And follow us on Twitter or media, or we'll have a new website. I think I didn't know leak to follow what we are doing so that we have a more gendered foreign policy. So again, thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. Have a great weekend and see you soon.
Stay safe and healthy.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.